Forged secretly in mortuary archaeology's hottest furnace, it's Archaeodeath. Welcome to another Archaeodeath interview, Archaeodeathlings. It's archaeologist Howard Williams here with another special guest for an Archaeodeath interview. We have Alice. Alice, please introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Hi, Howard. Thank you so much for having me on your channel today. So yes, my name is Alice Stevenson. So I'm based at UCL, where I am Professor of Museum Archaeology. It's not an oxymoron. You don't have to go into the field to dig things up. I like to look at things that have been excavated a long time ago. So that's my bread and butter. And I look after our museum studies program. But I also have a background in Egyptian archaeology, specifically Egyptian prehistory. So that's my little niche.
And who would think taking things from Egypt and putting them in a museum? What are the odds? You know, no, it's an obvious connection, isn't it? There's, we have collections. It's not just about display. It's the stores. It's the research. But museum archaeology it embraces the entire world for good reasons we're going to address. But Egypt has a special relationship, doesn't it? Obviously, so that makes sense that you've found your way into that field. Maybe, I don't know. but welcome. And I'd like to talk to you about some of your, basically be driven by your key research themes. And I know every researcher has so many and different things that come to the fore and then fade to the background as they take on new research projects. So we can't capture everything, but and viewers know that. But I want to touch on some of the key things. And really, I'd like to start off by asking you, Alice, about how did you get into museum archaeology and Egyptian archaeology? What was the relationship? Was it Egypt first, then museums, or how did you become you?
Yeah, it's a great question, because sometimes I wonder, you sort of think, oh, how have I ended up here? So when I was a teenager, I had no intentions of being an archaeologist. I was going to be a vet. But then when I was about 15 or 16, it just started appealing more and more to me. Now, full disclosure, it could be because my grandfather was an archaeologist. So a little bit of a Nepo baby, maybe. So it was a career. It was something that I could see. And more specifically, he was a museum archaeologist as well.
No way. I didn't know that.
that. There's this self-mythologizing that can be done there. But in my final 6-year high school paper, I actually did a paper on the Vikings. Yeah.
Second shock. Not the Vikings.
Yeah, I did a whole paper on Scotland, and I was applying for university at the same time. So these things came beautifully together, and so I applied to do archaeology. And for me, it was always the stuff. It was not field work. I liked the encounter with the past in its very tangible way. And so when I was doing my undergraduate degree in archaeology, I tried to get out of fieldwork as often as I could and spend more time in the museum basement. And I never really looked back.
Oh, it's wonderful, and it's really important. It's frustrating that it needs to be constantly hammered home that archaeology is not digging, but there's so many different ways to be an archaeologist: in the field, in the lab, in teaching archaeology, researching in different ways. Libraries, they do still exist, but it needs to be said. You can be a professional, expert archaeologist, in academia or by not digging, So
I think it's one of my major philosophies, I would say, is that actually these museum collections, you can still do archaeology. Museums are not just places for displaying or managing collections. They're places where people go and do really great archaeology. Yeah. So there's lots of opportunity.
So you have everything from things that have literally entered the stores in 1862 and have never been opened or studied, through to things that have been looked at again, but within different paradigms, with different methods and different. So is that the kind of things you mean?
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. But of course, it's not just the things, it's all those, one of the things we say in archaeology is that we need to record everything. That's what archaeology is. We need to record context. But how many of us then actually work with that legacy data? Where does it go? Yeah. So I'm interested in all the different ways that you can encounter archaeology in its wider ecosystem of maps and photographs and engagements and histories. And I think that's probably why I came to Egypt, not because I was fascinated with the land of the pharaohs, but I think because Egypt has such a strange dominant presence in the museum. It's such a museum culture, the weight of those collections. And I think that's probably what attracted me as someone that was interested in archaeology in the museum, that there's something about just all of that stuff so far spread across the country and the world.
It is. It's global. When we think of Egypt and museums, we think British Museum and big museums. But like every local museum that I go to, there's a mummified hand, or there's a random, cartouche of whatever, or there's a or a set of beads or something very humble that just it got there, and it gets a little case in the side next to, whereas most of their stuff is Roman or Bronze Age or from Britain or something like that. So yeah, the Egyptians are everywhere. They've got and that reflects the culture, doesn't it, of collecting and so on. So I mean, what is the special? Where did that weight, as you put it, I think that's a really good way of putting it. How did that weight accumulate? Is it because of empire, colonialism, and just collecting, or was there some? And the popularity, or was it was just from the beginning of the empire to the end, or was it a specific moment that Egypt took off?
I mean, it's such a great question. It's something that that's part of the research. I mean, Egypt's always had a very strong presence in Europe for centuries. But yes, I mean, when you look at the spread of collections and when they start to proliferate, it goes hand in hand with British interests in Egypt, and French and European colonialism and imperialism in the country.
And so museums, and this is something I'm going to come on to in a little while, but museums aren't just, there is a popular stereotype I still face on social media sometimes, is that like they think that literally I, or someone who's never specialized in ancient Egypt, because I'm an archaeologist or Egyptologist / Egyptian archaeologist, and their museums literally directly acquired this stuff, whereas most of it is not that way, or maybe it's a bit more complicated across the field. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mix of travelers. You could get Thomas Cook tours at the end of the 19th century. It was Cook's Canal, as it was known in the sort of 1870s, first package holidays. But really, I think it's just that coincidence between the development of archaeology, the development of museums, and the British occupation. So basically, you're looking at the 1880s, and in the 1880s, we see museums just in the number of them increase all over the country. Every town, starts to want to accumulate things, and it happens at the same time that the British occupy Egypt, and then you get the Egypt Exploration Fund.
Yes.
So all of this is a coincidence of things that just sort of leads to this cleaving open, the opportunity for this material to start flooding, this exodus.
Yeah. And so, obviously stuff has been bashing around Europe far earlier, but that is a real fundamental sort of moment. And suddenly the British public and have access to this material. And I keep coming across it because I study cemeteries, and so I see the Neo-Egyptian, rise of Neo-Egyptian themes in funerary architecture as one of the, never a majority, but always there's every churchyard across the country will have at least one obelisk, and or one a tomb with a design element that you can go, oh, that's kind of a bit, they're trying to be classical there, but they've got a bit of an Egyptian thing going on, so yeah, it permeates the whole of society, doesn't it?
It's quite extraordinary how it kind of becomes part of the consciousness and part of the fabric of just the Victorian world. It becomes a sort of, and we see it, I think, still today. I always find it quite, I stand back when I see those media headlines, things like, talking about dentists. Dentists have been around since antiquity, and then there'll be a picture of, an Egyptian thing, and Egypt just becomes this default representation of antiquity and the museum, and the same up there with the dinosaur fossil, an Egyptian coffin, and a Mona Lisa. They've become these museum cultures that we just really take for granted as a sort of cultural reference point.
So we've inherited that tradition in our age, in a post-empire, and we're heading towards, there's been decades of discussing repatriation, decolonization. What does that mean specifically for Egypt and the whole conversation of what you've been contributing through in your research?
I think, one of the things is Egypt is so widespread, everyone is very familiar with it, but that ancient Egypt, it's clear it's not a time or a place. You know, people, if you try to ask people when is ancient Egypt, they couldn't tell you. And people could be very, very familiar with the ancient culture and be very surprised and know nothing about the contemporary peoples of Egypt today. And so there's a lot of assumptions there about narratives about decline of civilization, that they had this wondrous ancient past, and yet, you know, this contemporary society that people don't know very much about, and it's very different. And that's sort of also compounded by the fact that a lot of the work around repatriation and decolonization has been driven by activist groups, civil rights groups, particularly in North America, settler countries, and that's got a lot of visibility. But you know, places like the MENA region, North Africa, around Iraq, Iran, Syria, North Africa, really quite a blind spot. You know, there hasn't been as much discourse concerning the contemporary peoples there, because Egypt, and to some extent, you know, and Mesopotamia, I'll put my little scare quotes around it.
Every word needs scare quotes.
They've been considered orphaned cultures. You know, we don't have to worry about them because you know, those ancient civilizations don't have descendants, which is just not true, and not how the contemporary communities there feel and how they relate to their heritage.
I mean, I suppose there's the various, so much we could talk about here. We could go on a whole rant about the fact that obviously these regions are still unstable, and you know, war, conflict, and part of that seems to be the characterization of the peoples that are there are still, they're not structured enough to look after their own cultures, and they're doing the robbing, you know, even though of course the middlemen and the collectors are the ones who are funded. So there's all those stylizations, and the whole fundamental sort of Islamophobic and Orientalist narrative of, you know, the Islamic age puts an end to that world, the ancient world, the whole concept of the ancient world versus the Middle Ages or the medieval, which in Europe and the Southwest Asia play out very differently in terms of our, I don't know, it's all that, isn't it? It's all that baggage.
It's a lot of baggage, and the multiple colonialisms, and and there's extraordinary complex histories there that we're largely ignorant of, yet we're very happy to put, you know, ancient Egypt into our galleries and think it's unproblematic.
It's still seen as neutral, isn't it? It's like we can all disagree about modern politics, but we can come together in a shared stride through a gallery, you know, and that sense of I'm learning, I'm enculturing something. There's a connection. It's all sketchy, isn't it? And I mean, yes. So we have these obviously again on social media. I kind of know this happened, but it happens more and more that I'm, as a Brit, I'm sort of being seen as, you know, responsible for personally acquiring the British Museum's collections, and I laugh about that a bit. But there is a genuine point there. Is that there is still a sense of there's an unresolved national conversation that isn't happening in the UK about, you know, where do our responsibilities lie. And I think most academics have been trying to have that conversation, but there's just no appetite for it. So I don't know if from an expert in Egypt, whether you feel that's unfair or that's a fair characterization.
So that we're not addressing these things,
perhaps we've been having these conversations academically, but no one wants to it never hits the headlines, or rarely does. It has quite some good examples recently, but you know,
I think it's got a lot more visibility now, actually. When you think, I think a lot of the, you know, when you look at news stories or social media, and it's become a bit of a meme now, particularly for Egyptians, that, you know, they say World Cup is on at the moment, and sadly Egypt have just exited, but I'm already seeing memes about, you know, the match was stolen from us, but it's okay because it's in the British Museum, you know. It's
there's so many British Museum jokes, it's quite overwhelming. It's become a joke, but a joke with a serious underpinning, but it still seems people are very sensitive to this, you know, in terms of if you try and say any of that in certain conversations, it gets very defensive about this, as if, I think, you know, how are we going to facilitate these conversations becoming more, you know, more prominent still, you know, are there any specific, you know, do you think trajectories towards repatriation of specific items, or is it all locked down within the legal and political frameworks we're in, that it's only going to be a conversation, it's never going to be action in the same way as we've seen repatriation elsewhere.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One thing, we do tend to talk about the British Museum, but to what extent is it representative in the UK? And there's lots of great community work and collaboration, repatriation, restitution, all those different forms of giving back and restoring. But with the British Museum specifically, I do have quite strong feelings on that. You've got the 1963 British Museum Act, which, apparently forbids the trustees from deaccessioning, for being able, they'll hide behind this. But actually, one of the clauses is that if something is unfit to be in the collection, it can be considered for return. And so you could argue that there are lots of things that are unfit. And actually, Benin bronzes have actually been returned in the past, for example. And they've got these Ethiopian tablets as well, which even members of the staff, even British Museum members of staff, are not allowed to touch or see. They're kept in a locked room. They can't be displayed. They're so sacred to communities, in religious communities in Ethiopia. They're not fit to be in the British Museum collection. So it's just a matter, I don't think it's a matter for Parliament, it's a matter for the trustees to use the powers that they have, that Act gives them, and make those disposal, repatriation decisions. But the political context for those, I think, is probably the barrier, rather than,
I'm a great fan of that. I didn't know that, I must admit. I'm not completely, that's why I'm talking to you. I'm not up on these issues. But one of the things I like about this, to reflect on that, is the word unfit or not being fit for purpose. I find a very useful phrase in university administration processes, feedback. I say, well, this process isn't fit for purpose. And I think that's a very diplomatic but very robust way of saying, this isn't working, rather than saying my more colloquial, it's a balls up, or it's a something. And I think that applies to collections. And the word unfit, I think, works really well there, because it gives that sense of it is out of place geographically, culturally, whatever. It's not and it's not actually unfit in presumably educational terms too. This is not in context of a story. So I think like that it's there then, right? Okay.
There's the other part of it that it can be disposed of without detriment to students. But of course, there are students worldwide, and people would argue it's a universal museum, it's open access, but of course our borders aren't. And lots of my Egyptian colleagues really struggle to either afford or get through visa processes. So, and they are students equally having arguably more of a right to this material. So, yeah.
So the conversation is happening, and outside of the very weird niche of the BM and its
very specific national act.
There is a lot going on, and within the limitations of funding, because this is the other thing I say to people who sort of chat. They say we have so little funding, but within that framework, things can be repatriated. There's a lot going on. No one's hoarding on a national scale. There's a lot of sympathy and understanding of the need for repatriation. But what about the stories? Can I just ask a follow-up or subset of that? What about the stories we tell with the stuff that is here? Do you think that we've been able to move towards making people aware of the history of those collections and and the story, and changing the stories that we tell while they're here?
So there's definitely been developments, the object biography and telling collector stories, but unfortunately we tend to then recenter those colonial histories and those particular collectors, or telling individualistic stories rather than the more complicated sets of relationships. As archaeologists, we can get into archaeological theory and the ways in which objects have multiple relationships and meanings and these sorts of things. It is the fundamental challenge in museum archaeology, and I actually don't do too much on display. I'm very much a collections person, but that challenge of the label and how much actual information you can give to the public. And so it's selective, the choice of narratives. And I think that's what's very telling. But I think there's definitely, even within those constraints, there's definitely a move to using those words to telling a very different story.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I find I've seen examples. I haven't had a chance to go to them myself, in that Egypt, and some really sort of showcased on social media some really interesting new attempts to show daily life or different aspects of ancient Egypt that don't usually get told, but with the vast collections that don't often go on display. So I think there was a lot of innovation there. I still think that block of time approach to the ancient world, as you say, still becomes a sort of an amorphous, sort of millennia long sort of blob of time in people's minds. I mean, in my mind probably as well, as somebody who doesn't do ancient Egypt, but it does seem such a intractable, and that sort of allows people to say, oh, it's okay to do that. But I suppose one thing I really wanted to ask further on, though, is how do the mummified human remains fit into this? How do the bodies, I mean, there are non-mummified human remains, but vast majority is the mummified remains. How do you feel these sit in the mix within Egyptian archaeology, for a start? I'd like to also ask about how they relate to other kinds of human remains, but what do you feel? I mean, Egypt is known, one of the dominant, is mummified human remains. How do you feel? Are we changing the way we're displaying them at all, or thinking about what should happen to them? They were once people.
Yeah, so there is definitely a big shift in the last just 3 or 4 years around Egyptian mummified remains in particular. And again, a lot of other parts of world archaeology have addressed this with longer history, but it's much more recent. I think one of the big challenges is because these individuals have been on display in so many museums for centuries. We have normalized the practice of viewing them. And so, you'll have museums that say, well, we asked the public and they don't have a problem, looking at these individuals. But who is that audience? They have certain expectations that the museum itself has produced. These bodies are as much, the way in which they're presented, are as much a product of museum practices as they are the ancient culture. And so, but if you ask the public what they learn about those individuals, they might say, oh, brains come out their nose, or they wanted to be mummified, and they wanted to, be alive for eternity. And actually, work by people like my colleague Christina Riggs has shown and clearly demonstrated we know a lot about what ancient Egyptians, different periods, different approaches. But one of the key elements is that mummified bodies were sacred. You were creating a sacred being, and that, that was to be buried in Egypt and to be part of the land of Egypt. So fundamentally to be displayed. So there's that ancient perspective. But actually, I think what's, and people say, do you afford respect to that individual, or who's the respect for that we're trying to create in museums? And I think for me, the most important part is that by the way in which we approach these remains is the respect is how we respect contemporary communities. Through the respect we give, we can show respect to living communities through those processes. And so what has been left out of the conversation for so long has, of course, been Egyptian communities today and how they feel about their ancestors being so far away from home, being unwrapped. And there is that brutal history. And you wonder if the public knew more about the brutal history of unwrapping, racial classification, all of those sorts of things, would they still be comfortable saying, yeah, I love going to see these things, and it's great. But if they don't know, if they haven't got that information, then they're just going to fall back on the tropes that have been created over the centuries, and horror movies and Halloween and, cuddly toys, and you can get chocolate mummified, all of these things. And it's going to be a really long process to counter those decades and centuries of creating this other hyper-real Egypt that just bears no resemblance to either the ancient past or the contemporary present. We've just created, that's the real monster.
And attitudes to indigenous remains have transformed and lead the way, give the example of that we could be following here, I suppose. Is that fair to say, or do you think there's something different about ancient Egypt that's not an appropriate model to,
my friend Heba Abdul-Gawad, who's really leading in this space, would say she identifies as an indigenous scholar. So I think that approach and activism and that language is something that is useful to kind of be making these changes. But I think the important thing is that we don't just take one approach, the other, and a pride blanket approach. If you look at Mexican communities, for example. There are some Mexican communities who the most respectful thing you could do is display. Many communities on an archaeological site will say, we found these human remains, let's build a museum and put the human remains on display. So we have to be sensitive, and I think we need to have that process of conversation. So that one of the things that we found through conversations with our colleagues in Egypt is that there's less of a concern about Egyptian remains on display in Egypt, although there's a huge variety of views, as there are anywhere. There's millions of people in Egypt.
What? Egyptians don't all have just one view on this? My word.
But there's definitely a distinction between them being in Egypt and just the distress or when they see them abroad. That's different. So you can't just say, oh, well, they display them, so we can display them. No, that argument doesn't hold water either.
Absolutely. And the other thing that's so powerful about ancient Egypt is that not at least a sizable proportion, heavily biased towards the elite, of course, but we are dealing with named individuals in not, I wouldn't say every case, but in many cases, often there's dislocation. We have, as I said, like a mummified hand or a random foot or, broken up and we can't locate, but we are dealing with textual societies where we can connect a name and a role and some, even if it's just a soundbite, and that makes it even more difficult to countenance this treatment. Do you think that's a powerful aspect, or?
I think it's partial. I think that's a key part of it, and to humanize those individuals. There are dangers with that approach. I mean, the coffins and the individuals buried with them might not match the way we pronounce those names, the way that we've given nicknames. There's caveats. I'm an academic. I'm always going to find those.
Absolutely.
But having those names does form a connection, I think.
That's really interesting, and we've got so many new technologies and creative ways we can visualize the past. I know this is another real big area that you've been researching. I'm just really interested in this whole contemporary art and Egypt and the museum work that you've been doing, because I mean that's links to almost everything we've discussed so far about how do we involve. How do we, there's so many different ways of technology has been utilized, but also artists have been utilized to help bring those stories to life or just reflect on those stories. I wonder if you could give us a sense of what's been going on there.
So this has been a major trend. So from about the 1980s, you start getting one or two artists working in collections. Really from the 2000s, it becomes a thing museums do, whether it's to diversify their audiences, to lighten up their galleries, to bring an external critique in. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there to see different ways of understanding and knowing the past and disrupting some of our common narratives. But for me in my research, one of my bugbears, the thing that I started picking at, as you do as a researcher, was this phrase that by putting contemporary art in with archaeology, that suddenly the past and present are in dialogue. And I would always be thinking, dialogue? But what are we getting in that conversation?
I hear that a lot. Okay.
But actually it's a one-way street, because the artists are inspired by, does it actually change how we interpret the archaeological material? As an archaeologist, that's the bit that I'm interested in, is working with artists, an interpretive process, something. So I was taught by Colin Renfrew, and so I was one of his guinea pigs back in the late 90s when he was writing his book on art and archaeology. And I can remember doing a final exam on, the trowel is to the archaeologist as the paintbrush is to the artist, discuss, and thinking, I didn't do an archaeology degree to answer that. But actually those lessons have, so it's been in the back of my mind for a long time. So trying to find examples where artists really challenge us as archaeologists, that's what I find really interesting. But I don't often see that in the museum presentations.
So it's almost like they've got the so I'm trying to just get my brain around that. You said it very well, but I'm a bit slow. But it's almost like the artist is commissioned within discrete parameters. We want you to come in and be inspired by us or the stuff, which is itself an artistic creation of text, image, the arrangement of objects. It's all creative in a way, but they want it. It's not. Nobody's moving anything around the display cases or moving the display cases or going without the display cases or having different because of the artist. Is that what?
So they've got an image. They're going to come in and do their thing.
Yeah.
And I'd prefer that dialogue to be between the artist, in the process, and the curator and the archaeologist, and thinking about materials. And because actually, when you talk to artists, they go through a lot of the same sort of, working their way through this material. It's really interesting to think about those processes and conversations. And so for me, the process is interesting, but too often I think museums want the end product, the final artistic piece that will sit in a case, and somehow that's going to help with interpretation, or it's going to offer a critique. It's going to help with our colonial problem. We'll bring in an external artist and they can tell us we're awful. Look, we've done that. They're sort of sticking plaster. But actually, in terms of infrastructure and the way we go about doing things and the way we talk about things, and the way in which my practice doesn't get altered in that. So I make a distinction between insertion, where you just take a piece and put it in, an intervention where there's a little bit more, you've hired an artist, they've come to see the space and they've had to think about that space rather than you've just chosen an artwork to resonate with an ancient object. So there we go. So you've got insertion, intervention, and the thing that I would love to see is more interdisciplinarity, which is that genuine dialogue. And then, of course, you've got Doug Bailey and his art archaeology, which is more invention. So there's another mode there as well, you could argue, as well, for artists and archaeologists.
And does that actually happen in practice yet, or is that just within the mind of Doug? I mean, is it actually? No, I don't mean it. I mean, I have been a while since I've looked at his stuff, but I was a colleague of his for a year back in the day. But but I'm just trying to get a sense of. Is the nature of the very institutions and the way funding happens and the way projects happen mean that that's just a pipe dream, or are there genuine ways we can facilitate that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends. Again, it depends on the part of the world and where you're looking. So I know that Doug's been doing a lot of work with Europe and North America, and there's that archaeological reuse. Bulk archaeology, I know many of my colleagues hate that term as well, and letting archaeologists, artists use that material. You couldn't do that with Egyptian material. You can't.
No, that's what I was thinking. Yeah,
it's completely different. That it's a proposition that won't work in the context of Egyptian museums and Egyptian collections. That has to be something different. And so for me, there are artists like Sarah Salam or comic book artists like Nasser Jr. who are really offering genuine counter narratives that challenge us. So, for example, Sarah Salam, she'll photograph an object in a museum, but bring in Egypt into the frame. And for me, that's really important, because this idea that, the ancient and it's so timeless. I hear this all the time from Egypt. That's why it's so popular. It's timeless. That's just an excuse to make it placeless, to decontextualize it. And so what actually those artists are doing is another form of contextualization for objects that have been so often very violently decontextualized to the point that they're our imagination. They're so divorced from the past. They're so divorced from the present Egypt. They are just a museum culture that actually the artists, I think, is really necessary to disrupt our very, very, very set and staid way of seeing ancient Egypt. Here in this country.
Has there been perhaps an additional question there? Has there been any conversation about the choice of iconic object and the phrase itself, the language, ancient Egypt, trying to disrupt that, or is that still so absolutely indelible that you just have to, if you don't use the phrase ancient Egypt, if you don't show Tutankhamun's face, either his mummy or his, sarcophagus or whichever bit is, I forget which, people just won't tune in. Is that where do people sit in that kind of, well, we need a gateway drug. We need that kind of iconic representation and that phrasing, or do people feel that we should actually be trying to jettison that as well and just talk about late, I don't know what you'd call it, late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, North Africa?
Yeah, it's Oh, so many thoughts as you were talking there.
Sorry, forgive me if I'm not phrasing it the right way.
No.
As someone who's not a specialist in these areas. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I feel it very acutely because as someone who specialized in Egyptian prehistory, I'm the worst Egyptologist. I don't read hieroglyphs. I don't study Egyptology. I'm the worst museum person. I haven't really done exhibitions. And I'm the worst archaeologist because I don't dig. Great, none of those things pertain. But yes, I think there is, with all of these phrases, I think they can be very, very lazy, but I don't think it's helpful. You need to take people from what they know to what they don't know.
Yeah.
So, but the problem is we're really lazy and we just keep rehashing the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. And but I do think this is the other thing. I think iteratively, at first people, in the 1980s, you have these novel contemporary art interventions and people think, oh, I don't know about that. It's much more normalized now. You'll just go to your English heritage site and there'll be a bit of contemporary art. So I think if we, just keep doing these things, we can slowly shift the narrative. But something hugely radical at first isn't going to change things overnight. It's the repeated exercise. You need the radicality, I think, for visibility, perhaps. But that's a longer term. It's going to take a long shift, I think, because Egypt's so prevalent. It's so ubiquitous in museums and display cultures. It's a long way. It's got a long way to go.
So pulling all this together, is it possible? And this is a really unfair question because no one can do this. I can't do this for myself. Is there a career, contribution that this all distills into, or are you tacking between different fragments of research that address these themes but have their own integrity? How do you see your work in museums and Egyptian archaeology connecting?
So I think for me, as I would still identify primarily as an archaeologist who's interested in understanding the past, whether it be the fourth millennium or, but for the key bit of my research is that we have to understand where our interpretations and frames of reference come from, the words we use, the interpretations and frameworks we reach for. I think if we bring the historic depth and understand some of the social, political, and economic circumstances in which our interpretations happen, we can be better archaeologists. So that's where all of my work really comes from, is trying to, understand what are they doing in the 19th century, why are they collecting these things, or why are they displaying it in that way, or, and so this has sort of moved forward, and I'm now moving into understanding a little bit more about the contemporary antiquities market as well, which is another way in which, again, archaeology is moving, being interpreted, valued, and I'm really interested to see how that is, again, inflecting on our practices in museums, in the archaeology sector, because these are not disconnected. We can try and ignore these things. That's not the bit I do, but if my research has shown anything, is that we're all part of society, and these little bits, they slip through. So it's understanding that complexity and situating things in time and space, which is what archaeologists just so happens I just situate them in other times and places as well.
I have to ask, I wasn't going to ask this, but I have to ask then, do you find yourself compelled, or do you find yourself inspired to try and counter some of the more popular misconceptions of ancient Egypt, or do you feel that's something outside your capability or to do, when we're dealing with hugely ludicrous pseudo-archaeological narratives that are both, some of them are inheritance from the Orientalist age but some of it are brand new. They just come out of nowhere, and within 2 years, I'm for my period in time, I'm still learning about new conspiracies and pseudo-archaeology that I didn't even know existed. So I mean, I look on sideways at what's going on in ancient Egypt or research on Egypt, and I despair because I can't address those questions. But I don't know, do you feel you're in that position, or do you feel that's just really not something that is possible for you to do in your work?
I think everyone can do it in a little way. Some people do it at scale and others. I mean, I also think you need to recognize your positionality and what you can do. There's a lot of, I want to be an ally to my colleagues like Heba Abdelgawad and others who are really doing, trying to represent Egypt from an Egyptian perspective, and that is even harder work. But I think it's important because I don't think sometimes you're going to change the views of extreme or outlandish approaches to the past. But I think you can just be honest and transparent and demonstrate what you know. You might not change their mind, but people, you need something to counter that. Someone that's questioning goes, will I go with Graham Hancock, or actually I read this other thing, and actually that's better. You know, the people on the fence maybe. So I think do what you can, and you're small, and where you have your power or space, and also to treat everyone with respect, because I learned this as a curator, and I got a lot of research inquiries about the alien bodies I was personally hiding. I got a lot of that.
I was going to ask you about your alien body storage facility.
Yeah, it's, you know, the collection policy for that. But I didn't ignore them. I always replied. And I say, no, we don't have alien bodies, but, you know, you might be interested to know, we do actually have artifacts from outer space, because we had these meteoric iron beads from prehistory made out of meteoric iron, and just being as open. And my big win is I found myself on a UFO forum, and someone said, I think I believe her, as in me.
You do find that there's been I talk to my students about this, that there are always the characterization of these groups as believers in a cult is in many cases true, but if you can be very dangerous and threatening, and it can be exhausting and futile, but you can have conversations with people. And certainly outside of social media, if I meet someone in the street and they say, I believe that the aliens built the pyramids, I won't go, you freaking idiot. You know, I'll say, well, you know, that's odd, isn't it, though, because we've got a clear sense of, you know, and I'll say something, and they'll usually falter at that point. They'll go, oh, they just want to perform some knowledge of, they want to show they're interested in something, and they want to sound interesting. They're not haven't got, you know, heartfelt beliefs that they've had since the age of 12 that I know the aliens are out there, like that Keanu Reeves, Graham Hancock, you know, dialogue no, most people are happy to be swayed by some sensible points. Like, well, did you know about the evidence of this? And we've got evidence of extraction, you know, and transportation of stone. And oh, right, no, you know, they're happy to learn. You know, most people are not so doctrinal, so I agree with you on that score, and you can do it in that capacity quite effectively, can't you? You know,
just keep it, you know, just be as polite as possible and move on, and don't get sucked in. No.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. So I'm glad you. Thank you. I appreciate you. It's a difficult area to answer, but do you have any closing thoughts, maybe either aimed at future students or to current students, about your kind of areas of research that you'd like to highlight, or anything that you're working on that you'd like to sort of just give us some sort of whet our appetites for?
Perhaps those students that are thinking about doing archaeology, that it's, you know, there's career paths throughout, and, you know, it's not all, if fieldwork isn't your thing, don't be put off. Archaeology is a very, very broad church these days. And so we welcome all and everyone. So fantastic.
Thank you, Alice. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I do appreciate the sensitivities of trying to get you to soundbite your many years of dedicated research and teaching into this kind of conversation. But I do appreciate you saying that. We'll be putting a little bio and some of the links to your key resources, including your website, so that people can find out more. But thank you again for this really stimulating conversation about all things museum and Egyptian.
Thanks, Howard.
Follow Archaeodeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.